Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Now, from Troy to Cadiz and New Orleans to Normandy, armies have crossed oceans and seas to attack their enemies. From his new book, Armies Afloat, Dr. John Curatola returns to the channel to talk about how the US developed an amphibious warfare doctrine in the ETO. So, good afternoon, John. How are you today?
I'm doing well, sir. And yourself?
I'm good. So, we were just having a lovely chat over the last 10 minutes before going live, but the busyness of a historian, working at the museum now, writing a book. What's been up for you the last few months?
Well, I got to tell you, outside of being a company commander for Marines, this is the best gig I've ever had. We've been doing international conferences. I'm getting ready to travel out to the Marianas for about 10 days and do Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. Also, I got to go do a tour of East Anglia in May, so I'm prepping for that tour. So we just got a lot going on between trips, international conferences, and these kinds of presentations.
Well, isn't that fantastic? I mean, traveling the world to see the battlefield, it's all about that. But today we're talking, as I said, about in the top of the show about amphibious landings. So, folks, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of let John go through the main body of the presentation, and then we'll do questions at the end. I may jump in with a couple of things, but we're going to just take it from John's slides. So, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. Yeah, here's a question that I was a Marine officer for 22 years, and the Marine Corps kind of sucks all the oxygen out of the room when it comes to amphibious assault. And you think about what the Marine Corps has done during the Second World War, and the lore of what happens in the Pacific with Iwo Jima and Tarawa and Okinawa. But one thing that we don't really ever talk about is how does the U.S. Army learn to do amphibious operations in the European theater? Because there really aren't any Marine formations there. They're all in the Pacific. And here's a little interesting tidbit. If you look at the list of amphibious assaults conducted by the United States Army compared to the United States Marine Corps, it is stark. And I said this as a Marine officer. The U.S. Army conducted 146 amphibious assaults in the Second World War. The Marine Corps about 24. And in the ETO alone, the U.S. Army does 10 division-size operations. So you think about the fact that the Marine Corps is taking islands in the Pacific for strategic gain. The United States Army and Navy and the Army Air Corps and our British allies, so when I say Army, I'm trying to talk about the joint force here, is taking entire continents.
Yeah.
And so you think about scale and scope of what the U.S. Army does in the ETO kind of dwarfs the Marine Corps. And again, as a Marine officer, it pains me to say that, but you have to give, the Army and the Air Force and the Navy in the ETO their credit, especially when this was a mission that they were not at all interested in prior to 1942.
Yeah.
So, having said that, and given my props to my Army brethren, I'll put this slide up. Had the Marines landed at Normandy, that would have been DDay plus 30 there at the Reichstag. That's my opinion. You can find me on that later on. But as I mentioned before, the Army isn't interested in doing this. And they play with the idea a little bit in the interwar years with this idea of amphibious assault. And as early as 1903 at the Naval War College, there's a gentleman there who says, look, a strong nation isn't won by a Navy alone or by an Army alone, but it's a combined effort of both of these forces working together. And in 1927, there's some joint action documents written between the Army and the Navy, but nobody's really interested in doing this. And even when the Army is doing some exercises just before the war, you can see here on the slide the results of how they see, these exercises here in the pre-war era. That they don't go very well. They're clumsy. They're not executed well, and they're saying that if we were to fight a real enemy, these would end in a disaster. And there are even some Army officers who will say, you know what, this is really not an Army responsibility. Make the Marine Corps bigger and let them do it. And so what you see here is that the Army has a very, very steep learning curve, because we're going to go into Torch later on this year. And how does this happen? How does this unfold? Well, first, we got to go back to the First World War. Like most things with the Second World War, you got to see what happened, in 20 years earlier. And of course, we all know about Gallipoli and what happens to the Anzac Corps and the French and the British troops that are there. About 78,000 of these gentlemen land there. And we all know that it's a quagmire. It's a mess. It's a good example of a bad example. You don't have good ship-to-shore movement. You have poor intelligence. poor beach selection. You now have machine guns and long-range fire and poor amphibious platforms. And so we know this thing kind of bogs down into a quagmire. And then by the end of the year, they withdraw. And the lesson that is learned from that is, hey, don't do those. In modern warfare, amphibious assaults are suicide. So we're not going to do that. So the plan is go find some place where the enemy isn't, land there, and then we'll do, some kind of subsequent land campaign. That's what the Americans are looking at during the interwar year too. We're not really focused on this idea of amphibious assault, except for the Marine Corps. We're looking for a job basically after the First World War, because you got 2 units running around wearing green uniforms. One's Marine and one Army, and people are asking, what's the difference? And so the Marine Corps latches on this idea of amphibious assault under their Commandant John Lejeune. And he's also going to tap one of his smart staff officers, a guy by the name of Pete Ellis, to start looking into this problem. We all know that there's the colored operations plan, or the O plans, in the interwar years. And of course, War Plan Orange is the one that deals with an American war with Japan. And using that as a basis, Pete Ellis goes out to the Palaus and he starts looking at what would the requirements be if the U.S. was to conduct a naval campaign against the Japanese Empire here in this big lake called the Pacific Ocean. And in 1921, he publishes what's called the Advanced Base Operations in Micronesia, and it frames the problem. If you're going to do an amphibious assault from the sea into the teeth of enemy defenses, what are the requirements? What do you need? What are the tools? What are the procedures? And so he kind of lays out the problem. And during the interwar years, this is where the Marine Corps really makes its money, is it starts developing this idea of ship-to-shore movement and amphibious assault. And in 1934, they're going to put out what's called the Tentative Landing Manual that really frames this problem in doctrine. And that will become, the Navy will adopt it and be Fleet Training Publication 167. And the Navy will take that and they'll turn it over to the Army, and the Army will adopt it and make Field Manual 31 TAC 5 in 1941. And so what you see is the doctrinal foundations are, of course, built by the Marine Corps, but it's the Army that really is going to execute this in very large scale. And I think what's important to note is this is what Commandant A.A. Vandergrift, who wins the Medal of Honor at Guadalcanal, says about the Marine Corps' contribution to the Second World War. You can see here, if you read it for yourself, it's not the Marine Corps' battle ribbons that it wins during the war were the most important. It's the doctrine that it developed before the war that is most important. And I think coming from General Vandegrift, that really says something about putting this foundation that everybody basically uses in terms of assault, because we have to fight away games. America doesn't fight home games. That means you got to power project and you got to get ashore. And by having this doctrine already cooked and baked, really sets the United States up for power projection.
Do you think in sort of 1940-41, before the US was in the war, people were able to visualize just how large amphibious operations would become 3 or 4 years down the line? Because when we talk about air power, which of course is another one of your fortes, people even in the early 30s, late 20s are thinking very, very big about the potential of air power. The tech hasn't in fact caught up with the ideas in many ways. But with amphibious warfare, are people visualizing just how big, for example, things will get when you get to, I don't know, Okinawa or D-Day?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, even the Navy isn't interested in amphibious assault during this time. The Navy is interested in obviously the Hayes Gray underway. The battleship is still the ship of the line. We're going to have these large, crossing of the T, Mahanian kind of battles in the blue water, not the brown water, not the littorals. And so they're really kind of put into a backwater to a certain degree, even by the Navy itself. And of course, as you mentioned, air power is something new and unusual. And maybe we can have war on the cheap now, if you believe, the dictates of DDay and some of the interwar theoreticians, that we can have war be relatively quick, relatively painless, given what happened in the First World War. So yeah, the scale and scope of amphibious assaults as it grows during the war is something nobody really foresees as early as 1940, 1941.
Cheers. Thank you.
Now, in order to talk about an amphibious assault, I think it's important to talk about some of the building blocks, and this is the framework by which I kind of discuss how the U.S. learns to do amphibious assault, and this is what the tentative landing manual kind of spells out as the six foundations of amphibious assault is command relationships, naval gunfire support, air support, ship-to-shore movement, securing a beachhead, and logistics and communication. I think it's important to kind of explain these one by one. All amphibious operations are inherently joint, meaning there's a Navy component and a ground component, whether it be Marine, whether it be Army, doesn't matter. But the question is, who's in charge? Who's running this show? You have the commander of the amphibious task force, who's the Navy component. Then you have the commander of the landing force, or the cliff, who's the ground component. And later on, you have the sequence in an air component. But as we're writing this doctrine, the question is, who's in charge of this operation? Is it the Army or is it the Navy? And what you see here, this requires a nuanced approach to command relationships. When I'm on a Navy vessel, I'm basically letting them take me to my area of operations for an assault. But once I get in my landing craft and I move from ship to shore, that relationship changes from supported to supporting, i.e. the Navy is now supporting me as I cross the line of departure and build combat power ashore. This requires an understanding between both the Navy and the ground force themselves. This is a very nuanced command relationship. Naval surface fire support. As I put my foot on dry land as a U.S. Marine, I have to build all my combat power ashore. And one of the things I really can't do very well in the Second World War is bring artillery ashore relatively quick. And the king of battle, he can't swim. So that requires naval surface fire support to kind of help me out with combat power as I come ashore. Well, the problem with that is naval gunfire is relatively a flat trajectory, unlike a howitzer that kind of shoots behind and defilade. So there's some problems with naval surface fire support. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Also, stealth versus firepower. Do I want to land under cover of darkness without any kind of prep fires, or do I want to prep the battlefield or the shoreline before I come ashore? And this is a doctrinal difference between the Marine Corps and the Army. We'll talk about this a little bit more later on. But this requires coordination between the Navy and the landing force in terms of fratricide, shifting fires, targets, and those kinds of things. And so you have to have a really good understanding of what you expect naval fires to do in an amphibious assault. And as I mentioned here, what you're going to see is the concern over friendly fire and the value of the element of surprise. Also, the Navy may see targets that are great opportunities like bridges or road networks, but if I'm the Army commander, I might need that bridge, in a subsequent operation. So don't blow that up. And so, you see some differences in terms of concerns regarding targeting itself. Now, in the European theater, the United States Army is big on stealth for most of the Mediterranean operations. They do not want shaping fires. They think that it's more efficient if they go in under cover of darkness without any pre-D-Day fires. Now, on D-Day, as we know in Normandy, they changed their tune, but there's a reason for that. But initially, they don't want to do that. They'd rather have stealth, and they're not really familiar with naval procedures in terms of fire support at this time as well. The Marine Corps is completely different. We're going to go in the daytime, and we want shaping fires before we go ashore. So there is some doctrinal difference between the two services. As I mentioned, too, naval fires are relatively flat. Well, airplanes are those things that can be dynamically tasked, and they can get behind a berm. They can get behind a hill or a mountain that naval fires might not be able to hit when they're in defilade. And so the idea of using aircraft as a supporting arm is a whole nother element that you throw on top of this. And plus, you have to deconflict your naval fires with your air fires because you have big sky, little bullet kind of stuff, but you can still hit an airplane, with a round if you're not coordinating it very well. So who is coordinating this? Who is providing spotting fires for your naval gunfire and staying out of the way? And so how do you coordinate this between the surface fleet, the air fleet, and the landing force that's going ashore? Course, ship to shore movement. How do I get off my big boat onto a little boat and get to shore? And I'm sure most of your audience here knows about the Higgins boats, the development of those going from ship to shore, and of course, the Roebling Alligator, which becomes the LVT-1 that provides the conveyance from ship to shore. And this was something that went as late into the 1930s, where the United States, the Marine Corps was fighting with the Navy to build these small, the landing craft. And Andrew Higgins from here in New Orleans, which is why the museum is here, fights with the Navy along with the Marine Corps to team up on the Navy to actually build effective ship to shore movement platforms, and why we have the museum here in New Orleans today. But when you think about ship to shore movement, it isn't just the platforms. Sequencing, prioritization, wave assignment, who's in what boat, who goes in what wave, what's the hydrography look like at that particular beach, how big is the frontage. These are all those kind of answers that you have to look at, questions you have to ask yourself regarding the beach itself. Is it suitable for an assault? What does the surrounding area look like? I always make the amphibious assault akin to those who are smart about airborne operations. You have to assign each man a seat in that aircraft. Same thing in a landing craft. It has to be that level of degree of detail regarding the planning and the movement from ship to shore, just like you do jumping out of a C-47 or if you're landing on a glider. And again, it's not just combat power, but it's also supplies and equipment and infrastructure. And you're going to have to fight the tyranny of what we call Cuban weight. Fuel and water weigh a lot in terms of bulk. Ammunition weighs a lot. How do you get that stuff ashore so you can support your landing operations once you've actually established a beachhead? And here's what early ship-to-shore movement looked like when the Marine Corps still had horses. So that was one way to actually work. And once you are ashore, you have to establish what they call a beachhead. Okay, as Army soldiers and Marines come ashore, somebody's got to organize that morass. You just can't dump stuff off on the beach and expect units to find their class 1, their class 3, or their class 5, or evacuation points for the wounded or the casualties. Somebody has to secure this, organize it, so it can support subsequent operations and receive follow-on waves. And on top of that, communications and logistics, obviously talking to not only the naval surface fire support and the air support, but also in the movement control piece. When you can launch subsequent waves, when do you need the floating dumps to come in and provide certain classes of supply because we're running low on something. And this requires communication between the CADF and the CLIF, and at the same time, logistics. Not really sexy, but modern armies obviously require a lot of class 1, 3, and 5 because they're mechanized entities. So how do you organize this movement of logistics ashore in an expeditionary environment? And so that kind of lays out these tenets of an amphibious assault. And when I went through and looked at what the Army did, I used this as a framework to talk about their development. Now, I mentioned earlier that nobody really wants to do this amphibious assault stuff. And I found this quote in one of the primary sources about how the Navy viewed the amphibious fleet, and I'll read it to you. And it says, a scufflaw sailor was telling a shipmate his long list of infractions of Navy discipline. When a shipmate asked the scofflaw if he was getting a bad conduct discharge, the scofflaw replied, hell no, I got 15 days in the brigs and ordered to amphibs. And his shipmate replied, gee, that's a lousy break. So it kind of tells you, that the Gator Navy before the war was kind of the lower class.
And just to jump in, we have these visions of what can be achieved with amphibious warfare because we know we can look at Okinawa and, well, we're going to talk about the crossing of the Rhine with you next month, but in terms of set piece battles, army generals can be inspired going back centuries. You can look at all these warriors going back, Napoleon to Alexander the Great, and say, well, that's what we're going to model this on. This is our basic footprint of what we want to do. But with amphibious assault, although in the top of the show I talked about Troy and Cadiz, they are tiny compared to what was achieved in World War II. So there's not even some sort of example to follow.
No, and traditionally, wherever the enemy is, you don't go there in an amphibious assault. You go somewhere, do what we call an amphibious movement in a benign environment, where nobody's shooting at me or attacking me, and I can build up a lodgment ashore for subsequent operations. This idea of going into the teeth of enemy defenses in an amphibious assault is something that only the Marine Corps really embraces in the modern age as an application. And a lot of people are shaking their heads going, well, this is really stupid. But historically, you don't do that. You go someplace where the enemy isn't, build your lodgment, and then do your subsequent operations ashore.
Brilliant. Thank you.
So at the beginning of the war, of course, we realized, wait a minute, forcible entry is going to be a requirement. And this gentleman here, Kent Hewitt, he's in charge of the amphibious force, the Atlantic Fleet there in Norfolk, Virginia. And I think I'm of the opinion that Kent Hewitt is one of the unsung heroes of the Second World War. He's not a good-looking guy. He's kind of dumpy, but he's one of the guys who takes the Army and the Air Force and the Navy, and he clunks their heads together and says, let's all learn how to talk to each other. Let's all learn how to operate. And this is no easy feat in a time when service parochialism is, of course, everything. You have the Department of the Navy and you have the War Department. The two shall never meet. And that really is kind of the parochialism that exists, prior to the war. And so what he's going to do is he's going to create this amphibious assault school in Virginia and in around Maryland. And he's going to bring in Navy and Army personnel within the same staffs and within the same classrooms so they can learn each other's language. For example, for an Army artillery officer, when he was calling in some fires, if you shot long, he would say you were over 200 yards, whereas a Navy would say adjust down 200. So, some of the basic verbiage that the two services would use would be confusing in battle. And so he starts these schools to have them have a common vernacular. At the same time, the Army's starting to realize that, forcible entry might be something we're going to have to do. And they're going to establish an engineer amphibious command at a place called Camp Edwards up there in Massachusetts. And they're going to start establishing engineer support brigades, kind of like Seabees, but for the Army. These guys that can work in a littoral environment and receive men and equipment from a landing craft and move it ashore. They're going to start doing this kind of stuff. And the Army will establish an amphibious training center at Camp Edwards. Then they will also establish one at Camp Carabel, Florida, there in the Panhandle. And there's also an argument between the two services. Who's responsible for the coxswains? Ship-to-shore movement. Is that a Navy mission? Is it an Army mission? And they haven't figured this stuff out quite yet. They will. But again, this is still, on the drawing board. Another thing that they established at Solomon Islands in Maryland, it's called the Mother of Invasions. The Navy will establish an amphibious training base there in the Chesapeake. And they'll just practice doing ship-to-shore movement with Army forces on the East Coast. The Marines have all been pretty much shipped to the West Coast and the Pacific. There's a notional division of labor between the Army and the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps will be the Pacific because they're smaller islands, more suited for the size of the Marine Corps, whereas the Army is bigger and it has a continental mission. So there's a notional division of labor that's laid out in 1942. And something else the Navy does is they're going to acquire Bloodworth Island there in the Chesapeake just for naval surface fire support training. So, and it's the first time somebody's actually doing that to establish a training venue for gun crews to provide that kind of support for forces that are engaged in a littoral environment. And so you see Kent Hewitt really the founding of this development of the U.S. Army. And he's actually talking to Patton before Torch as they're loading ships up for Operation Torch, telling Patton, get your officers up here to Norfolk so we can help you load your ships, so we can combat load them. Because we don't know what you need first. You know what your missions are. We're not necessarily familiar with that. And I found a number of letters where he writes to Patton, basically dressing him down, saying, get your officers up here to get smart on how to load these vessels.
Brilliant stuff.
Camp Carabel, as I mentioned, is in the Panhandle, and it was not a nice place to be. As you can see here, somebody referred to it as the Alcatraz of the Army. And when Omar Bradley visited, he said it was the most miserable installation I'd ever seen since my days at Yuma. And the guy who selected it should have been court-martialed for stupidity. Fortunately, the mission of training divisions at Camp Carabel goes away relatively quickly, and they start doing most of the training overseas, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So our first real foray into amphibious assault is, of course, in Torch. Now, why are we going to North Africa? There's a lot of reasons, and a lot of good reasons in hindsight. At this stage of the war, the Brits are the big brother, and we're the little brother in this war. They have more skin in the game. They're driving strategy, and they want to secure the Mediterranean as a sea line of communication, the Suez Canal, getting to India. It also saves shipping time when strat lift is really at a premium. Instead of going around the southern Africa, you can go through the Mediterranean. And so the Brits are really interested in, of course, defeating Rommel. And in Torch, the Americans are going to conduct 9 separate landings at 3 locations you can see on the map here. You got the Western Naval Task Force with Patton there on the west. You're going to have Fredenhall in the center, and then you're going to have Ryder there on the Eastern Task Force. But as this operation unfolds, there's a number of problems that occur. Slow debarkation procedures. Why? Because you have these soldiers laden down with 60, 70, 80-pound packs trying to climb over the guardrail of a boat and then climb down a rope ladder into a moving landing craft in the middle of the night. It takes inordinately longer than they thought to get the guys off of the APAs, off of the transports, into the landing craft. Also, many of the amphibious ships didn't have enough landing craft on them, so they had to take landing craft from another vessel in the middle of the night, go find the APA in the middle of the night, and then do offload in the darkness while the seas are moving around. And so almost every landing there in the Western Task Force is late. Almost every one of them has a late landing time because they can't get all the soldiers in the boats at the same time. Also, you have navigation issues. The coxswains are not well trained. And so they're trying to navigate from ship to shore at dark. And their compasses are kind of sketchy in the first place. And they're not really trained. A lot of these coxswains had never seen an ocean before they joined the Navy or the Army. And so you have a lot of guys are landing at the wrong beaches. And of course, what that means is your sequencing and your combat power generation is really going to be problematic because you're not building all that combat power you thought you were going to have. Also, we talked about logistics. The beach parties that show up to provide that logistics ashore, well, they don't really know what they're doing. And they're landing at the wrong beaches as well. And a lot of the soldiers there are running off of the landing craft. They're not helping unload the landing craft with the supplies on them because they're in a tactical environment. And quite frankly, they're scared. You know, that's what soldiers are. They're in a combat environment. And so what you see is the logistics already breaking down. Now, the good news is the Vichy French don't put up much of a fight. It kind of depends where you land as to how much fight they put up. And some of them do fight. But the good news is it's not significant like you see in Normandy. And so we're able to get ashore. Another thing that you see here at this part of the war is that we need ports to unload the heavy tanks and the heavy equipment. We haven't developed those littoral ships that can move stuff from ship to shore. So everything we land here is based upon getting towards a fixed port somewhere in the vicinity of the landing area. As I mentioned, this doesn't go real well. And here's what Lucian Truscott, who becomes the CG of the 3rd Division, he says the combination of inexperienced landing craft, poor navigation, desperate hurry resulting from the lateness of the hour finally turned debarkation into a hit-or-miss affair that would have spelled disaster against a well-armed enemy intent upon resistance. Another soldier says, we received no opposition whatsoever from the beach. If we had, in that condition of landing, it would have been a complete failure, in my opinion, as troops wallowed in boats, and those in the water would have been helpless against enemy fire. So again, this idea of ship-to-shore movement is really problematic, even in what you would say a benign environment. Again, there is some combat that occurs during this, but had it been a determined foe, you would have had problems.
I've always thought, as a Normandy guy, if people bang on about Dieppe being the big learning curve for Normandy and D-Day, I'm completely, that Dieppe makes no difference at all. It's Torch is where everything that ends up being built on for Normandy is done. Without the strategic reasons for taking North Africa, as you said there, I think are justified, or we could go down a massive rabbit hole talking about that. But if for no other reason as the Brits and Americans getting their act together and learning how to do this shit, I think Torch was absolutely essential for what was happening a year later.
Yeah, and I would make the argument too, Paul, even for that the entire Mediterranean campaign is the classroom that allows Normandy to happen. You know, and one of the most telling things here is this report here. If you look at the circles, these are the Western Task Force losses of landing craft. You can see they lose just in the Western Task Force, about 34% of the landing craft are destroyed. Notice the one on the very bottom. The Eastern Assault Force lost 94% of the landing craft and ship-to-shore movement, either from the coxswains, poor navigation, the weather, the tidal variations. We're not very good at this. And so when you see these numbers, it kind of speaks to the problems that we're having. It's indicative of it. As a matter of fact, Ike's aide, Captain Harry Butcher, replied in the spring of '43 that Eisenhower joked that if he died, his coffin should look like a landing craft because the lack of them was worrying him to death, quote unquote.
It's the other thing. How many do we need? Yes, as many as you can possibly make, and then double it. Yeah.
And one of the things I'd like to point out here too is we tend to forget the fact amphibious lift is always at a shortfall. You never have enough boats. It's just like with aircraft and strategic airlift today. You never have enough. They're always at a premium. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we go along here. So after Torch, this is what the Army does, is they established the 5th Army Invasion Training Center at Port-au-Prince, Algeria. And I hope I said that right. I don't speak French very well. But what they do is they establish 7 different schools there in North Africa: a tactical leadership battle school, an air observation school, an amphibious training center, an air assault training center, a tank destroyer center, an engineering school, and even a school for liberated French. And they take all of these after action reports that the Navy and the Army puts together, and they create a joint school with both Navy and Army working together to write new doctrine, new TTPs, tactics, training, and procedures, working together. And this graphic you see here is actually from one of their lesson plans, talking about beach organization in a littoral environment. And they'll also start doing a number of amphibious exercises, and they'll bring in equipment sets from the United States, and they'll set up these bases in North Africa. There's a number of them. What's interesting is when they have the 1st Infantry Division do some amphibious training there in North Africa, after they landed at Torch, they actually assault some of the same beaches in the training exercises that they did in combat. And some of their instructors were never in combat. So you can imagine Terry de la Mesa Allen had some issues with these gentlemen training his soldiers who had already been in combat in those locations. But something else that's important, and I just mentioned it, is platforms, ship-to-shore movement. And by the time you're getting ready for Husky and the operation over Sicily, you have new platforms: the landing ship tank, the LST, the landing craft tank, the LCT, and the landing craft infantry, the LCI. And we're going to start developing pontoons that will help kind of bridge the gap between the beach and maybe where the landing craft beaches itself. The LST itself, I cannot stress enough importance of that vessel. The United States will build about 1,200 of them. The Brits also build a few hundred of them as well. I don't have the number on top of my head. But to underscore the importance of the LST, when the Italian campaign is underway and they're getting ready to do the planning for Normandy, and Churchill is intent on liberating Rome as a precursor to the Normandy invasion, they keep telling him, well, wait a minute, we need these LSTs for Normandy training and stationing and getting ready for the big assault. And it keeps frustrating Churchill. And he finally says, and I quote, "The fate of 2 great empires rests with some goddamn thing called LSTs." And they get into food fights over the allocation of LSTs, not only in the European theater, but also there's a whole nother war going on in the Pacific that the Americans are fighting. But the LST is important because I can take 4,000 tons right to a shoreline, open the clamshell doors, and I can drive out tanks. I can put landing craft on the side of it. It's got about 9,000-mile range. They're not pretty. They're not sexy. And the troops even call them large, slow targets because they kind of chug along a little bit. But what you're seeing here with these new vessels, I don't need a port. I'd like to have a port, don't get me wrong. But now I can power project across an unprepared beach and then push inland. This is a significant change in American capabilities. Which, of course, takes us to Husky. And, of course, you're going to have 3 infantry divisions are going to land there. The Brits are going to land at Syracuse, and the Canadians at Paquino, and the Americans are going to land here at Joss, Dime, and Cent. What you have here is we're learning how to get shipped ashore better with these new conveyances. But something else happened here in 1943. We realized that, air power is going to be important. We had naval air at Torch. Now I don't have any naval air for the Sicily operation. I have to rely on the Air Force. And during that same time frame, the Air Force was given equal footing with ground operations. And Army Manual FM 100 TAC 20 comes out. It puts air operations on the same level. And what happens is a lot of the air planners don't feel that they need to talk about or plan with their Navy or Army brethren. The Air Force is very interested in doing battlefield air interdiction, going long, going deep, shaping the battlefield that way. They don't really feel the need to do what we today would call close air support. So as 7th Army goes ashore, there is no air cover over the amphibious objective area. And so the Luftwaffe and the Regina Aeronautica have a field day over the fleet. Fortunately, they don't sink as many vehicles or ships as they could have, but it disrupts the operation itself because now I can't move ship to shore. I have to dodge these rounds that are coming in. And so you have a problem that there's no air cover over it. One thing that the Air Force does do, and the Navy works with them, is they take some of these LSTs and they weld steel decking on the weather decks. And they actually take off these small little L4 gun spotter aircraft that fly in the amphibious objective area, calling in fire for the naval surface fire. It's some innovation that occurs in theater during this time. You still have some problems with the coxswains getting from ship to shore, and you also have problems with beach party organization. But again, what we're learning here is how to get stuff from a ship and a littoral platform ashore. Also, the Navy does an excellent job in terms of naval surface fire support. On D+1, the United States is up. The 1st Division is up against German forces that are coming down the Gela Plain, and through a coordination of naval air and Army armor and artillery, they defeat that. Matter of fact, those German forces get within 1,000 yards of the beach line. And there's a fire direction center afloat that is helping to coordinate not only naval fires, but also ground fires. So we're putting fire direction centers on boats now, ships, sorry, my Navy brethren, ships to help coordinate this. At the same time, the Air Force is also starting to learn to put an air support coordination center on these ships as well. It doesn't work real well. The guys don't have a lot of tasking authority. They're limited in bandwidth. But again, they're starting to think maybe we should have some kind of role in a littoral environment. However, Northwest African Air Forces has different ideas. They don't have a lot of authority in the Husky operations, but we're going to see something happen in the next operation. And here's what Patton says about the Air Force. And here you can see where the Luftwaffe and the Axis Air Power is having a heyday over the fleet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, this takes us now to the next youth operation, which is Salerno. And you can see the map here. The Brits and the 8th Army are going to cross the Straits of Messina and go into Regina, Calabria. And you're going to have a British operation there in the heel at Taranto. But the Americans are going to land here at Salerno with the 36 ID and the UK 10th Corps here. And a lot of people ask, well, why do we go to Salerno? Why don't we attack somewhere north by Naples or by Rome? Well, the problem is, one, the shorelines aren't as good, but two, you're outrunning any air cover you might have with single engine aircraft. even if you have drop tanks on, you're still facing loiter time problems. So that's why they kind of look at Salerno. The beach topography is fine, and the air can actually cover it. Now, we get into this question of prepping the beach line. And the Navy here at Salerno will say, hey, we identified 275 targets that we can pre-sight for you to help you get ashore. Okay. Well, Major General Ernst Dahle, who's in charge of 6th Corps, he defers to his commander of the 36th Division, who says, no, I want to be stealth under cover of darkness. I don't want you to prepare prep fires. Well, the problem is the Germans have already prepared this area, and they have Tigers dug in defenses, good fields of fire, and they're well prepared for this. And as a result, when the forces get ashore at red and green, they're able to make a small toehold, but at yellow and blue beaches, it is problematic. Matter of fact, Blue Beach doesn't even reach its operational objectives on the first day. Yellow barely, but red and green are able to get a toehold. But what you see here is because we didn't prepare those areas with fire, it was harder to get ashore. Something else happened is that the Germans put a minefield out there, and we have insufficient minesweepers. And so a lot of the landing craft that are going to come in subsequent waves can't traverse that minefield. Some brave skippers do, and they go ashore regardless of the minefield. But what you're seeing here is that the Navy isn't necessarily prepared for the problems of mines. Also, we still have a problem with poor beach party function. We're offloading stuff. The ships that do make it to Red Beach are just throwing them on the beach. There's no organization. And so only about 50% of what was supposed to come ashore that day actually gets unloaded on the beach, and it's still a mess. But good things happen. The Air Force is actually providing close air support over the amphibious objective area. They are attacking Luftwaffe bombers and fighters as they're flying over the fleet. They are attacking them when they're showing up over the beach line itself. The Air Force also establishes what's called Rover Joes over this area with close air support. Not only are they taking calls from troops engaged, they will radio those requests to the Air Support Coordination Center afloat, and then they will also help direct the fast movers, the P-51s, the A-36s that are coming in to provide that kind of close air support ashore. So you're seeing here a huge step in the short span of 2 months. The Air Force now is playing ball. They're part of this. And this is all happening at the bottom level, working up, not the top down. You know, the doctrine says they're on co-equal, but the thing is now they're figuring it out. We all need to work together. And you also see the integration of naval fires and air fires. Something else I'd like to mention here too. In Sicily, most of your patrons know that the 82nd Airborne has a difficult problem in terms of D+1 because most of them are shut down by the Navy as they fly over the fleet to support the 1st Division. Well, we learned a lesson here. And so what we do is we have the 82nd Airborne not fly over the fleet, but they fly south of it. And they pass the word to all the anti-aircraft gunners, don't shoot at anything after 9 o'clock and don't shoot at anything above 5,000 feet. And so when they insert the 82nd Airborne to plug the gap between the British and the American lines, it happens without any fratricide. And considering what happened just 2 months earlier, you see a huge step in airborne effectiveness here between all the services. That takes us to shingle. We all know they get stuck at the Gustav line, and this is Churchill's bid for success to take Rome before Normandy. And we're going to do this left hook, and we're going to have Major General John Lucas's 6th Corps, because Dahle gets fired, and Lucas is now in charge. And the idea here is to cut the German line of communication down to the Gustav line. But here's the problem. Normandy's coming up, and this is January 1944. You only have so much amphibious lift. You only have enough lift to land 2 infantry divisions there in Shingle. Well, the problem with that is your area that you're going to take is relatively large. And so you don't have a lot of combat power there. And so the beachhead is like 7 miles deep, 15 miles wide, and a 26-mile perimeter. It isn't strong enough to get to these lines of communications at the Alban Hills. But we're still going to do this thing. So again, this is where amphibious lift gets to be a problem. The good news is when the Americans land and their British counterpart, it's a relatively benign environment. You only run into a few drunken Germans or sleeping Germans there in the defenses themselves. But because we only have a few divisions ashore with some Rangers and some parachute infantrymen, your ability to get to the Alban Hills is not feasible, because does the commander want to risk himself and go to the Alban Hills with a weak force and hopefully have it and have his lines of communication severed, or is he bold and he go there? And this is a discussion that historians have had for a while, that he wasn't aggressive enough to seek that. But I would also argue that he's being prudent in trying to harbor his forces and build combat power. Now, as you well know, the Germans were able to mobilize their divisions and they create this beachhead salient, around Anzio, and it turns into an artillery slog for months. We know that. Okay? But take a look at what's happening here. The Air Force, again, is really being innovative here. Not only are they providing the Rover Joes, they're also providing what's called pineapple flights, where they are looking for moving targets and calling in fire on those. They also have air control centers to help manage the airspace, both afloat, and then they'll move them ashore. Then what the Air Force will do is they will co-locate their air support centers with ground commanders and have nightly discussions over targets, prioritization, and procedures. So you're starting to see coordination of fires between all the elements, between the Navy, the Air Force, and the ground component right here. One of the things we also come up with is the new radio, the SCR 300, which becomes the staple radio for U.S. forces in the European theater. And I'm going to harp on logistics here. One of the things that happens is again, we have to keep this combat unit supplied. Well, all the LSTs went away. They only had 6 left. So what they established is the Anzio Highway, where they would send 6 LSTs down to Naples with trucks on them that were empty. They would mobile load the trucks, put them back on the LSTs, sail them back up to Anzio Harbor once they cleared it out, roll off the trucks, unload them, roll the empty trucks back on the LSTs, and then sail them back down, and do this on a daily basis. And that was what's called the Anzio Highway. So what you're seeing here is the innovation of mobile loads being utilized to support that beachhead at a time when my amphibious lift was relatively small.
Just a quick question before we move on from Shingle. After Husky and with Avalanche, do you think that there's a bit of a kind of a skimping on things with regards to Anzio, and that they because they kind of got away with 2 broadly successful landings, they go, well, okay, let's use a little bit less, which causes them to then think about, when we get to Normandy, however much we've got, go more. Don't ever, if you've got it, use it. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's one of the things that's what's amazing to me, and I talked about the LSTs, that's what's driving the equation with only 2 divisions going ashore. There's some that come in subsequent waves, don't get me wrong, but I think it's Samuel Eliot Morrison in his history of the campaign. He says, we sent a boy to do a man's job, meaning that the size of the force was not big enough to be as aggressive as we had hoped it would be to sever those lines and get to the Alban Hills. And so I think one of the things that we take away from this is, you got to have sufficient combat power, but that's also dependent upon the lift equation again. And I hate bringing that up again, but you got to get to the fight. And that's part of the problem here that the Allies have, specifically here at Anzio and Nettio.
Thank you.
Thank you. So again, this takes us to Overlord. And again, this is the main effort. And as we talked earlier, Paul, this is the culmination, everything that we've learned between the British and the Americans and how to work together. But I think one thing that's really interesting here is in that 3rd bullet, they established called the Q School, or the Quartermaster School. They're at Norfolk House in London. And what they do is they bring in the planners from both the Brits and the Americans, and they start talking about joint staff functioning, orders generation, doctrinal familiarity in this big, huge assault that we're going to conduct here in Normandy. And what's interesting is that you see some of the nuances coming up between the Americans and the British, in that The Americans' perspective is that the British counterparts were old fogies, where the British countered that you Yanks were new to this game and you have the enthusiasm of beginners. You know, but the idea here is you're learning how to do staff functioning in a process that is very detail oriented. And it's not boring, or it's not interesting, it's not sexy, it's boring, but it's important in terms of the detailed planning required. We're going to establish a number of training bases. The most important place often gets overlooked at Woolacombe. That is where the Army will really develop its European doctrine, and it's a training location to get these units up to speed. Slapton Sands is your live fire range, where you can actually practice your combat environment. But at Woolacombe, they do a lot of dry runs and embarkation drills, kind of the more boring kind of operations, but to learn, hey, how do you protect your landing craft? What you disembark, and what do the formations look like? Slapton Sand is where you're actually sending rounds down range and learning how to work in a combat environment. And of course, there is combat occurs at Slapton Sands at Operation Tiger, as we know, in the spring of 1944. But again, we're learning how to do this embarkation, and we're going to use almost every British port and smaller port. And I know, Paul, you know better than I do, the hards that we build there, to facilitate the loading of these amphibious ships. And you see a huge logistics effort between the U.S. Navy and the Royal Navy to facilitate combined joint operations between the two navies themselves. And I think it's important to kind of understand that the United States, when it sorties its fleet for Normandy, it's like 98% of that fleet floats. 98%. Very few of those ships are broken because of maintenance. That speaks to what the Brits are doing to help us maintain this fleet as we're going to go from ship to shore. I've been harping on coxswain training, and what we do, we establish a boat school there to, again, further train the coxswains and teach them how to recognize terrain from the littorals and recognize the locations and where they're going to land so they can navigate better. They will also give them intelligence packets with photos from the Air Force, both from the oblique and the above, so they can triangulate the photograph with the map that they've been given. They're also given better compasses and better navigation equipment, so the ship-to-shore movement isn't as perilous in terms of trying to find your way ashore. And as you know, in Normandy, most of those troops make it to their respective beaches. I know at Utah, they're pushed off, 2,000 yards, but by and large, they land kind of where they're supposed to be. At the same time, the Army's Expeditionary Support Brigades and the Navy's beach battalions start working together so they can hand off at the high water mark from when the Navy delivers it to when the Army can assess it. Not only do they train together, they're the same units that are going to be seeing combat on those beaches, so they keep those units married up. Now, we know that the Navy gets a lot of gruff for the lack of battleships that are sent to Normandy. They only send a handful. But one thing that you cannot deny is what the Navy does with the destroyers.
Yeah.
And they really save the Army's bacon with these brave crews coming within 1,000 yards. And as you well know, Paul, some of them have a few inches of water underneath their keels.
Yeah.
And some of them are taking direct fire from German formations. And so the destroyers, in terms of naval fires here, is key. And on top of that, if you look at the slide, there's 44 shore-fire control parties ashore, 9 shore-fire control parties with each individual division, 1 per individual battalion, and they have the radios are accompanied with what's on the Navy itself. And so, again, we're all talking on the same sheet of music now in terms of coordinating fires, and I cannot emphasize that enough. Air power. We all know about the transportation plan and what it does to the Germans' ability to move stuff around inland in France. And there's some equivocal arguments about how effective it was or how effective it wasn't. But here, the Air Force is playing ball. They didn't want to, but they do. And they do wreck a lot of northern French, rail lines. But you also see, even before the assault begins, 8th and 9th Air Force, they're already providing some of that pre-landing fires. Now the Army has now learned, maybe we have enough equipment now. Let's shape that battlefield. Let's shape those beaches before we land. And of course, you know that story, and I won't go into depth with it. But you see here, the Air Force is now helping shape those environments. And they're going to fly 2,000 cast sorties just on D-Day alone. And on top of that, the Air Force is also going to have air support coordination centers afloat. They're going to also put air support parties with the units ashore so they can talk on the same networks, and they can have that kind of combined arms integration that we talk about. And that's where I'm going here with communications. 90,000 transmitters in the amphibious objective area. Now you think about bandwidth. We use that term a lot. And here, this is not modern digital equipment. These have crystals and those kinds of things. And during the planning for the communications annex, they have 21 detailed sets of instructions and annexes to avoid stepping on each other. You're going to use both AM and FM frequencies, and you can see within the air support parties, you have one with each regimental combat team. He's got to talk to the guy overhead. He's got radios that can go about 25 miles out in range. They wanted to send bigger radios out there, the SCR 399, but it was too fat and too heavy. They couldn't put it on a boat, so they lit these smaller ones. But what they did was they allowed the flagships to get the requests from the ASPs, and they would forward them to Uxbridge. Then Uxbridge would develop what you would call the air tasking orders there during the campaign itself. And so what you see is Army working with Navy, working with Air Force to coordinate air support. And one thing they also do is they have these what's called fighter direction tenders, or FTDs. These are LSTs that are modified with radars to look for the Luftwaffe if they're going to come in. They actually developed these during the Husky operation, but they didn't have a lot of authority in terms of tasking. Here they do. And so again, you're seeing the Air Force being put on vessels to provide that kind of support. Logistics, logistics, logistics. Class 1, 3, and 5. And you can see here they already preload from D1 to D2 126 ships with 90,000 tons. I talked about the Army and the Navy beach parties already working together. And on D-Day, 130,000 troops come ashore and 17,000 vehicles. And you're going to see here the planning requirement is going to go up exponentially as the D-Days pass. And by D+16, you need 12,000 tons per day coming across those shorelines to support subsequent operations. And who's going to control this movement of men and equipment and ships from ship to shore? You got to have some kind of traffic manager or shuttle control. And you're going to have the U.S. HMS Cape Town and the Sirius will serve as the traffic cop, moving ships from England to the continent and then back to England itself. So you have what's called BUCO, build up control and movement control and turn control, to help manage this fleet of ships that are coming from the UK to the amphibious objective area, and somebody has to monitor that. So what you're seeing is something that's not really sexy, but it's important to the smooth logistics of stuff from the UK at the strategic level down to the tactical level of war. One of the things I've discovered in doing this research is I'm not a Mulberry fan anymore. We all thought those things are really cool and they're a great sign.
Off the show, John. That's it. You're not coming back.
But you know, when they get wrecked, you know, on the 19th and 21st of June, Mulberry A, excuse me, you know, and they are efficient. Don't get me wrong. But what I think what's more important is if you look on those last few bullets, when they resume on 23rd of June, they're moving 10,000 tons off of Omaha and 6.5 at Utah. And by the end of the month, they're not reaching what they wanted to, but it's enough.
Yeah.
It's enough coming ashore in a proven methodology with LSTs and ducks and LCTs. You know, they're reverting to what they know without, you know, the Mulberry, but it's enough. And I think it speaks to the resiliency of the force that they built. That
I feel I need to defend the Mulberry a little bit,
Go
which
ahead,
is always fun, because to me it's an insurance policy. Is that you're absolutely right. The landings on Utah, on Omaha, what they're bringing there, you know, as you say there, it's nearly reaching what they were supposed to be targeting via the Mulberries. But after the storm of mid-June, July, August, September, the weather was pretty damn good for all of that. So if you'd had another 4 or 5 day spell of bad weather, let's say that hits in late July or something, when you get bound to launch Cobra or something like that, that's when you'd have relied on your Mulberry Bee. So to me, it's like an insurance policy we didn't quite have to cash on. And it was a very expensive insurance policy that put the British economy fucked for like 3 decades after World War II. But I really wouldn't want to have not seen the Mulberry in place. It's that kind of fall back, that fire theft insurance, fully comprehensive package that I think the Allies needed. But I'm with you on the stats prove that it wasn't completely necessary, but I still feel it was better to have. Better to have it and not use it than not have it if you needed it.
Well, the one thing I will concede to you, Paul, is the Phoenixes and the Bombards and the Corn Cobs help keep that shoreline calm.
Yeah, exactly.
In terms of wave action, I will concede that those are helping keeping those shorelines capable of handling an LST without having it, get damaged or allowing you to have a sea state that facilitates offload there on an unprepared beach.
Yeah, brilliant.
And of course, here I've got a quote here from Gerd von Rundstedt, and what he talks about here on the 20th of June. He says, 4 things must be emphasized: our mastery of the air, large-scale employment of parachute and airborne troops. We've learned how to not shoot at each other. Flexible and directed support of landing troops by ship's artillery, and strong English naval units ranging from battleships to gunboats. Talk about the destroyers. And the rehearsal of enemy invasion for this task, the precise knowledge of the coast, its obstacles, defensive positions, and superiority of numbers on the beachhead after just a few days. Building combat power. And this is coming from Gerd here on the 20th, just a few days after the landings. And the last one we take a look at is, of course, Anvil. This one's delayed because they don't have enough amphibious lift. Ike is a big proponent of it. Why? Because he only has with Cherbourg, and we know that Cherbourg, is going to be spiked. But this gives him a second port. It's closer to Germany than Cherbourg is, and he really wants to do this, and it gives him a rail line and a road line. But what you see here in Dragoon, which is what Churchill calls it because he was dragooned into it at Anvil, is you see a very complex ship-to-shore movement, and you see 6 separate landing forces. And each one of these landing forces for the Alpha, Delta, and Camel ones are their own individual Caddis and Cliff arrangements. They've developed that kind of relationship that they can trust each other and they can work together down to the division levels now. This is something kind of new and unusual because the Americans and our British allies have learned to do that. At the same time, the air forces have learned to work together. The Royal Fleet Air Arm, the United States Navy, and the Army Air Corps are all working together under one air support coordination center that is afloat, and it's controlling both naval and ground-based air. And I think this is significant. We're all speaking the same language now. We all kind of understand how this works together. And so by the time Dragoon gets over, here's a comment from General Saville, who's got 12th Tactical Air Command, to Admiral Hewitt. He says, I'd like to express my appreciation for the outstanding work the naval aviators have done in perfecting cooperation. I consider the relationship and cooperation of this force to be a model of perfection and to serve as a standard for future operation. Well done and thanks. And again, this is kind of the exclamation point at the end of the sentence, about how well they're getting this stuff done here in the theater itself. So as I come to a conclusion here after an hour, the U.S. and their allied forces were learning organizations. Their innovation far outstripped that of the Axis, far outstripped that. Combined arms integration to a whole new level, surpassing that of the Wehrmacht. Large-scale expeditionary logistics without the need of a fixed port for initial entry operations. And we did away with the joint parochialism that we had. We learned how to work and talk to each other as a service and as an allied force. And I know I focus on the Americans, but this also includes our British allies as well. And so with that, I will take your questions.
Well, brilliant stuff. I mean, to plow through all those operations in an hour is impressive stuff. So some have been addressed as you've gone along, but here are the ones we've got in no particular order.
Sure.
So Gary August asked right at the beginning, were there any similar weather patterns experienced in both the ETO and the PTO, or were there, when we always talk about the apparent lack of kind of transfer of knowledge from the Pacific to the ETO, except in the notable cases when there was. But broadly speaking, as a Marine, ETO, Pacific, can you compare the two? Are they apples and oranges?
No, that's a great question, Gary. And if I gave you an answer, I'd be making it up because I don't know. I mean, I've served 4 years in the Pacific and I've lived in Europe. I would think the Pacific probably had its own problems. You got typhoons, that are a problem. You got, coral atolls that you got to deal with. There are different, meteorological, oceanographic issues between the two theaters. But in terms of weather, I'd have to look at each one individual case to give you a good answer, Gary. You stumped the chump. You win.
Okay, no worries. We've got some other ones. So Gary Giamara asked earlier on. I won't be able to make stay in, but he will pose my question now. You mentioned Camp Edwards. What do you think of the amphibious training received by the units like the 45th and 36th at Camp Edwards? I mean, you mentioned it. So was it vital? Had they got everything sorted out, or was it part of the general progression?
I think it was part of the general progression. The Army doesn't know what it doesn't know. Again, what's going on at Camp Edwards is 1942, so we don't have the lessons of Torch and in Sicily and everything else. And so they put together a fairly comprehensive training program, and they put them through paces. And matter of fact, I know that Camp Caribou, they actually fail one division and make them stay over Christmas time and do an assault again. But I think knowing what they knew at the time, it's fairly comprehensive and fairly well done, given that it's 1942. And of course, those units will also go through rehearsals and other training under 5th Army Invasion Center there in North Africa. So that's one of the things we also learned, is you have to keep practicing, refining your procedures. And of course, soldiers will unfortunately be killed, and you got replacements come in, and they have to be trained as well.
So obviously your book and most of your presentation is focusing on the US Army, but you had several comments, and here's two representative ones. One from John about the Coast Guard, probably going to be answered later, about how many amphibious crews Coast Guard rather than Navy. And Scott Grimwood said, can John talk about the US Coast Guard landing crews? I mean,
excellent.
You talked about the Air Force, talked about the Navy. Coast Guard are kind of the bastard child of the amphibious assault, because they're doing it, but no one talks about it.
Absolutely, and I'm glad that they brought that up. Many of those coxswains are Coast Guardsmen, and then many of they will also put out a number of patrol craft in the amphibious objective area, in specifically Normandy, that are helping guide coxswains from point A to point B. You maybe got to your shipping lane, or you're going someplace not supposed to be going. Many of those crews are indeed Coast Guardsmen, and that is a glaring omission, and I should have brought that up, that those guys are there, and they're taking rounds too. And those same Coast Guardsmen, you'll also see them in the Pacific as well, doing much of the same responsibilities as coxswains. They're moving Marines to some of those islands in the Pacific.
So you had some people agreeing with you about Hewitt. Gregory Fontenot, Colonel Fontenot, was on saying, some positive things about Hewitt. And this is another comment from a viewer. Torch was a disastrous landing operation. Without that lessons, Sicily, D-Day, or Dragoon would have been failures. Hewitt is truly one of the greatest underappreciated naval leaders of World War II. So people echoing your thoughts there. A question here about, you mentioned the Anzio Highway, and you talked about the progression. I feel that Torch was integral to Normandy, because I'm a Normandy guy. I maintain that Torch was when the US and UK relations were at its lowest ebb, although nowhere near as bad as how it was on the Axis side. But we kind of muddled through and got through to, as you said, singing off the same hymn sheet. But Andrew Flindell's particularly question was, where and how were the US methods proven? Was the Anzio Highway one of the key moments in this linear learning curve? Is always that? I mean, you kind of covered them all, but is there like one you would say that's the key one?
Yeah, I think it's important because they're able to generate combat power and provide it class 1, 3, and 5 in a way that had never been done before. This is really some initiative. And there's actually a kind of a food fight between the Navy and the Army, because the Navy wants, or the Army wants to put, ammunition and fuel on these Navy vessels. And the Navy is focused on safety for a lot of reasons. Some of these things are not compatible, in some of the holds. And the Army kind of says, well, we're in combat, so do it anyway, And so you have, a learning curve here. And I do think that, and we still do this today, this use of mobile loads. You park the truck and they will put something in the bed, and that way I can drive it off much faster. I can push it off the side and get that truck right back on a vessel and then go back. And so what you're seeing here is efficiencies with regard to loading vessels. And the Army will also learn about combat loading. One of the problems they had with the Salerno operation is that the Army actually owned the ports in North Africa. Well, they hadn't learned the combat loading methodology that the Navy was big on. And so when they built the loads in for some of these APAs, they were administrative, meaning they're maxing out the cube and the weight. They're not combat load where you're massing it, the ability to get stuff off when you need it, when you really need it. And so, the Anzio Highway is one of those things that develops a tactic, technique, and procedure that we still use today.
Yeah.
So I think it was brilliant that they just kind of thought this thing up.
And something you said, or the tone of your presentation reminded me of the show we did with PM Knight a few weeks ago about British tank development, where he's taught for an hour and a half without mentioning armor and armament. It was all about fixing them, moving them, transporting them, getting the crews trained up. And I'm thinking of that fantastic spearheading D-Day book by Jonathan Gorn that you must have on your shelf.
Yeah.
We all got it on our shelf. And with the loadings of the LCAs and the LCVPs and OMAR. And I've kind of always learned it from that way, from that small up to big. But what you've made the point is actually, to understand it, you've got to start at big and work down to small. The slide about the netting of all the radios ahead of D-Day is not the way I've thought about it. I've thought about those little individual flotillas of landing craft chugging their way towards the beach. But actually, as I just said, you've got to understand the bigger picture behind that to understand, it's how your Marines, how your Army actually deploy out of an LCVP makes a difference, but it's the infrastructure behind it that is critical.
Yeah, I make the argument, and you and I had this discussion before, Paul, that at the strategic and operational level of war, it's all about throughput. Yeah. How much stuff, men, material, aircraft, it doesn't matter. How much can I get to a theater? And then retail distribution, as you talked about, at the tactical level. And that's one thing that the Allies, and I know all your patrons know this, we do well. The Axis stinks at it. Yeah. You can be as tactically astute as you want to be, but if I don't have class 1, 3, and 5, guess what? I'm not going very far. And the Allies do this in spades.
Well, that's the thing. We did Operation Veritable yesterday, and you look at the learning the British and Canadian armies, and indeed the American armies, have done since Normandy and Veritable and Grenade and all those things there, and they self-examine, whereas the Germans just, whether it works or doesn't work, they just essentially keep following exactly the same plan. It's that, because persistence, and the Allies are going, no, this isn't working efficiently enough. Let's refine it. Let's tweak the numbers again. Let's keep looking at it. And I think it's important. So a couple more questions from viewers. And I like this one. Their torch was a disastrous landing operation. Oh, no, sorry, it's wrong one. It was about this one here. Sorry. It was the one about from John about how much was Dragoon helped by having Patch leading the forces, given he was originally Army in the Pacific.
Yeah, that's a great point. Patch is used to working in a littoral environment. He's the one who actually, as a Marine, he's the one who secures Guadalcanal there in February of '43. He's the one who finishes that operation there. So here's a guy who's combat proven already, who's used to working, in these littoral environments, and is uniquely qualified for this job. And again, Dragoon / Anvil always gets short shrift. I mean, and it's a very complex. You have an airdrop on top of all these 6 landings, individual landings on top of it, and it goes off basically without a hitch. Yeah, I mean, it's probably the most successful amphibious assault in the European theater. and it's large scale. So to your point, yeah, I think Patch's background and his skill set as an officer in the Pacific definitely played out. And one thing that they do in the Southern France campaign, they actually bring all the services. They move around from planning location to planning location so they can all be in the same room with each other, not just, sending message traffic or sending couriers, but this idea that, hey, we should all be in the same room so we can talk to each other. That's one of the things that Patch actually really does for the Dragoon/Anvil operation.
I think the thing about Dragoon, this is a massive rabbit hole, is it's considered a kind of an afterthought and not completely necessary. Well, we probably would have been fine without it. And, where we have, for example, those, we all can think of the meetings of the American and Soviet troops at the Elbe River, those kind of things, is that who can even remember when the army from south of France met with the army from Normandy? I mean, I had to look it up a few weeks ago because it wasn't in my head. And yet there's this big progression up towards the Vosges and off towards Alsace. We just don't talk about it enough. All that fighting in the Cologne, Koblenz, all that kind of stuff. It's the landings in the south of France, let alone their part in the amphibious warfare evolution. They are important. The liberation of Europe. It's just that it's not the. It's like the second match on TV. The highlight game that everybody's watching is what's happening kind of closer to the channel, pushing into the Ruhr. But there's this other game, this other armies fighting up more centrally that we're just ignoring. But
to your point, when you think about Anvil, we know what happened in the war, but Ike doesn't know.
Yeah, exactly.
He doesn't know. I may need that second port and those rail lines. And, he's thinking, again, strategic and operational. I need to get guys and troops and equipment ashore.
The ports thing has been fascinating. When we did the series about Brittany back in September, we now could realize the losses taking places like Brest and things like that, when St. Malo were worse than expected. But everybody is thinking in the summer of 44 that whatever ports we're going to get, we could do with more. We could do with, and as you said there, the statistics that were borne out from Overlord and what they could bring ashore on the beaches was fantastic. But people didn't know that. They didn't know what was going to be possible. So they're looking at every single possible way of getting stuff. Because as you say, you've got to get it all the way across Atlantic, and every little port, even when you're going to Normandy, the importance they're putting on places like Port-en-Bessin and Courcelles, which are basically tiny little fishing ports, but you can still bring stuff in. Stuff is what you need.
That was one of the things I found in my research was, there's like 4 or 5 little ports there in Normandy that they use, to your point, to be like it's like 1,000 tons a day, but it's still 1,000 tons a day, and it's amazing that they built this entire network there of these smaller ports.
Well, we will leave things there, except to say you are coming back in a few weeks' time to kind of do the culmination, really, an operational flashpoint and getting across the Rhine. And we talked before going live is that until I kind of read the blurb for your book, I hadn't really kind of thought of the crossing of the Rhine as an amphibious landing. I think of, we think of Bridget Remagen and Robert Vaughan and George Siegel and all that kind of stuff there. But actually, it is in some ways, as varsity is the culmination of airborne efficiency, they're getting across that river, which is for those folks who have not stood on the banks of the Rhine and looked across, it's not a little stream, the Rhine at that point. It is a massive obstacle. So you'll come back and do that. And in the meantime, folks, the link to John's book, Armies Afloat, is of course in the description below, where you can find it, your favorite bookstore. Is it out now? It is out? Is it
I just got a note this afternoon that KU has released it today.
It came out today. So there we are. Fantastic. So John, it's been incredibly fantastic talking to you. I will see you again in a few weeks' time. Tomorrow we are talking about Mary Sears, and we're talking about science in the Pacific, which also help with the amphibious landings. Don't forget to click like and subscribe, buy my guest books. But in the meantime, I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Cheers. Thanks, Paul.